When 10-year-old Maya realized no one in the bustling hardware store could see her silent screams, she knew she had to try something else. The man whose hand was gripping her shoulder wasn't her father, and every polite smile she offered to passing shoppers was a desperate, unheard plea. Her eyes landed on a mountain of a man, his leather vest covered in patches, his beard a storm cloud of gray and black. He looked serious. He looked like he wouldn't be easily fooled. In that split second, with her heart hammering against her ribs, she made a choice. She leaned just close enough for him to hear her tiny, trembling voice and made the strangest request he had ever heard. Please look angry for David Sticks Miller, a 52-year-old retired firefighter and member of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club. Those 3 words ignited instincts long dormant, setting off a chain of events that would turn a routine Saturday afternoon into a tense standoff that would save a little girl's life. The air in the cavernous hardware store smelled of fresh-cut lumber, chemical fertilizers, and the faint, metallic tang of new tools. It was a Saturday, and the aisles were teeming with the determined chaos of weekend projects. Fathers pushed carts laden with bags of mulch, couples argued over paint swatches, and hobbyists squinted at the complex diagrams on boxes of unassembled shelving units. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, shadowless glare on everything, making the concrete floor seem endless. It was a place of profound normalcy, a cathedral of suburbia where the only dangers were a splinter from a 2x4 or a poorly stacked display of terracotta pots. It was the last place anyone would expect to find a life hanging in the balance. Sticks was in aisle 7, the one dedicated to fasteners. He needed a set of 1/4-inch chrome acorn nuts for the fender of his Harley, a finicky detail that most people wouldn't notice but drove him crazy every time he polished his bike. At 6'3" with a barrel chest and arms corded with the kind of muscle built from hauling fire hoses and swinging axes, he tended to take up a lot of space. His leather vest, or cut, was a roadmap of his life. The large Iron Sentinels MC patch dominated the back. On the front were smaller, more personal patches, a memorial patch for a fallen club brother, a firefighter's Maltese cross, and a simple one that read 25 years. His face was a testament to those years, a network of fine lines around his eyes from squinting through smoke, a small, pale scar above his left eyebrow from a piece of falling debris. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, a concession to the fact that while he was a biker, he wasn't a savage. He was retired now. The pension was good, and the club kept him busy with charity rides and community work. But sometimes, the quiet was too loud. His body missed the adrenaline, the sudden call to action that had defined his existence for more than 2 decades. His mind, however, did not miss the things he had seen. He had learned to read people in moments of extreme crisis, to see the truth in their eyes when they had no time for lies. He could tell the difference between mundane panic and true, soul-deep terror. It was a skill he had tried to leave behind with his turnout gear, but it was etched into his DNA. It was always on, a low hum of observation running beneath the surface of his quiet retirement. It was that hum that made him look up from a small plastic tray of washers. He saw them near the end of the aisle, by the display of decorative light fixtures. A man and a little girl. The man looked utterly unremarkable. He wore a neat polo shirt, khaki shorts, and clean white sneakers. He had a friendly, forgettable face and a haircut that suggested he went to a respectable barber. He could have been any dad, anywhere. He was holding the little girl's hand, but his grip wasn't the loose, comforting hold of a father. It was tight, the knuckles of his hand showing white. He was steering her, not walking with her. The girl was about 10 years old. She was dressed in a pink t-shirt and jeans that were just a little too big for her thin frame, the cuffs sloppily rolled. Her sneakers were scuffed but clean, as if they were new but had been worn through a single, rough experience. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, but it was her face that snagged Sticks's attention. She was pale, her expression carefully blank. But her eyes were screaming. They darted everywhere, scanning the faces of strangers, flicking towards the store exits, then back to the man. It wasn't the bored, impatient look of a kid dragged on errands. It was the hypervigilance of a trapped animal searching for an escape route. Sticks felt the old, familiar prickle on the back of his neck. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the girl was a handful. Maybe the dad was stressed. It was a Saturday. People get stressed. He turned back to the bolts, telling himself to mind his own business. The world was full of unhappy families. It wasn't his job anymore. He wasn't on the clock. He was just a guy buying nuts for his motorcycle. But he couldn't shake the image of her eyes. He had seen that look before. He'd seen it on the face of a child he'd pulled from a car wreck, her parents gone, her world shattered in an instant. He'd seen it on the face of a teenager who had watched her house burn down, knowing her brother was still inside. It was the look of someone who had seen the monster and knew it was real. He abandoned the acorn nuts. He began to drift through the aisles, keeping them in his line of sight. He pretended to examine a power drill, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hand. He watched as the man led the girl to the gardening section. The man picked up a small, colorful watering can and held it out to her with a wide, artificial smile. "How about this one, sweetie? For your flowers," he asked, his voice loud enough for others to hear. It was a performance. The girl, Maya, just shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She didn't look at the watering can. She looked past the man, her eye sweeping the area. The man's smile tightened. He put the watering can back with a sharp, angry motion. He leaned down, his face close to hers, and whispered something. Styx was too far away to hear the words, but he saw the effect they had. The girl flinched, her small body cringing away from the man. A flicker of raw fear crossed her face before the blank mask snapped back into place. That was it. That was the moment the hum of observation in Styx's head became a blaring alarm. This wasn't a grumpy father and a difficult child. This was a predator and his prey. He felt a cold fury begin to build in his chest. In his old job, he fought fires. The fires were predictable. They consumed, they destroyed, but they followed the laws of physics. They had no malice. This man, this bland-looking monster in a polo shirt, was different. He was a fire of a different sort, one that fed on innocence and fear. And Styx knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was the only one there who saw the smoke. He needed a plan. He couldn't just rush in. The man could have a weapon. He could hurt the girl. A public confrontation had to be handled carefully. He needed a trigger, an excuse, a signal. He needed the girl to give him an opening. He followed them as they moved toward the front of the store, his steps slow and deliberate. He grabbed a random item from a shelf, a roll of duct tape, and got in the checkout line next to theirs. He kept his head down, hoping he just looked like another biker running an errand. He could feel the man's nervous energy, a tense vibration in the air. The man kept glancing around, his friendly facade beginning to fray at the edges. He was anxious to leave. The cashier in their lane was a young woman with bright pink hair, her attention focused on scanning their items, a candy bar and a bottle of soda. The quintessentials "I'm sorry for being a grumpy dad" peace offering. It made Styx's stomach turn. As the man fumbled for his wallet, his attention was diverted for a precious few seconds. Maya saw her chance. Her eyes, wide and terrified, met Styx's over the low partition of candy bars and magazines. There was no time for subtlety, no chance to mouth a word. She had to trust her gut. She had to trust the giant, scary-looking man in the leather vest. She took one small, brave step toward his lane. "Please look angry," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the beep of the scanner. Styx froze. The request was so specific, so utterly strange, it cut through all the noise in his head. It wasn't a plea for help. It was an instruction. It was a strategy. This little girl wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. She saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes and added, her voice barely a breath. At him, she gave the slightest nod in the man's direction. In that instant, the world narrowed to the space between them. The retired firefighter was gone, and the sentinel took his place. The ice in his veins turned to molten steel. The quiet Saturday was officially over. He had his signal. He had a choice to make, but it wasn't a choice at all. He could walk away, get on his bike, and spend the rest of his life wondering what happened to the girl with the screaming eyes. Or he could intervene, risking public humiliation, a possible assault charge, or worse, if he was wrong. But as he looked at her small, determined face, he knew he wasn't wrong. He was a man who had run into burning buildings for a living. He wasn't about to be scared of a suburban dad in a hardware store. He drew a slow, deep breath, reaching into the well of grief and rage that a lifetime of saving people, and sometimes failing to, had carved inside him. He knew how to look angry. He had earned the right. He dropped the roll of duct tape onto the conveyor belt without a second thought. He took 2 long strides and planted himself directly in the path of the man and Maya as they prepared to leave the checkout. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a 240-pound wall of leather and muscle. He crossed his arms over his chest, the old leather of his vest groaning in protest. He let his face settle into a mask of cold fury, narrowing his eyes and letting his jaw tighten. He focused all his intensity on the man in the polo shirt. The man stopped short, surprised. "Excuse me, buddy," he said, trying for a friendly tone, but his voice was strained. "You're in our way." Sticks didn't move a muscle. He let the silence stretch, letting the man's anxiety build. People in the nearby lines were starting to notice. The cashier with the pink hair paused, her hand hovering over her scanner. "I think," Sticks said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the floor itself, "you have something that doesn't belong to you." The man's friendly mask shattered. A flash of pure panic crossed his face, followed by a surge of defensive anger. He tightened his grip on Maya's arm, pulling her half behind him. "What the hell are you talking about? This is my daughter. We're leaving. Now get out of my way." This was Maya's cue. Playing her part in the dangerous script she had written on the fly, she let out a loud, convincing wail. "I don't know him. He's not my dad." The effect was electric. The low chatter of the checkout area died instantly. Every head turned toward them. The cashier's eyes went wide. A stocky man in a contractor's sweatshirt in the next line took a half step forward. The scene was no longer a private suspicion, it was a public crisis. The man was cornered. His gaze darted from Sticks to the growing audience, searching for an escape that no longer existed. "She's just upset," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "She's having a tantrum because I wouldn't buy her a toy. Now, if you'll excuse us." He tried to shove past Sticks, to bull his way through. Sticks didn't budge. He put a hand flat against the man's chest, not a push, but a firm, immovable barrier. The man felt like he had run into a brick wall. "We're not going anywhere," Sticks said, his voice dropping even lower, carrying a quiet menace that was far more terrifying than a shout. The man's panic boiled over into aggression. "Get your hands off me. That's assault. I'm calling the police." A slow, cold smile touched Sticks's lips. "Good," he rumbled. He reached into his vest pocket, but instead of pulling out a weapon, he produced his cell phone. Keeping his eyes locked on the man, he said, "I was about to suggest the same thing." He didn't break eye contact as he dialed 911 with his thumb. The lie he had told moments before was now becoming a reality. The final piece of the trap was being set. The man stared at the phone in Sticks's hand, and the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by the stark terror of the truly guilty. He was trapped. The little girl's desperate, brilliant gamble had paid off. The confrontation hung in a fragile, explosive balance. The man, whose name was later found to be Richard Gale, made one last, desperate move. He shoved hard against Sticks's hand, trying to wrench Maya and himself free and make a break for the automatic doors just a few yards away. But Sticks had anticipated it. He absorbed the shove without giving an inch, his boot solid on the polished concrete. At the same time, the contractor from the next line, a man named Tom, moved instinctively to block the nearest exit. Another shopper, a young woman with a baby in her cart, used the cart to block the other path. In seconds, an impromptu barrier of ordinary people had formed, a silent, civilian posse united by a collective sense of right and wrong. The store manager, a harried-looking man in his 40s named Bill, came hurrying over, his tie askew. "What is going on here? What's the problem?" Gale saw his chance to regain control of the narrative. "This lunatic is harassing me and my daughter," he yelled, his voice shrill with desperation. "He assaulted me. I want him arrested." But Maya, clinging to the back of Styx's thick leather vest, delivered the final, devastating blow to his story. "He's not my daddy," she sobbed, her voice clear and piercing. "He took me from the park. Please, don't let him take me." The manager's face went from confused to horrified. He looked from the panicked, sweating man to the terrified child hiding behind the stoic biker. He made his decision. He pulled out his own phone. "I'm calling security." Nobody moved. The wail of approaching siren sliced through the tension. It was a beautiful sound. 2 uniformed police officers strode into the store, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from chaotic to controlled. They were professionals, their eyes quickly assessing the scene: Styx, a calm and immovable object; Maya, the terrified child; Gale, the cornered animal, and the ring of concerned citizens. "All right, what's happening here?" the senior officer asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Gale started babbling his story again, but the officer held up a hand, silencing him. He motioned for his partner. "Jim, take him aside." He said to the cashier, "You saw what happened." He started gathering witness statements with methodical precision. The other officer, Jim, approached Gale. "Sir, I need you to step over here with me, please." As he began to question Gale, the man's story crumbled like wet sand. He didn't know the girl's last name. He couldn't name her teacher. He didn't know what school she went to. He claimed her birthday was in August. Maya, when asked later, would confirm it was in March. Within minutes, the cuffs were on. The bland suburban dad was gone, replaced by a defeated criminal, his head bowed in disgrace. The threat was neutralized. A female officer arrived shortly after, her demeanor gentle and reassuring. She knelt down, not towering over Maya. "Hi there," she said softly. "My name is Officer Davis. You are very, very brave. Can I get you a blanket?" "You must be cold." Maya finally loosened her desperate grip on Styx's vest. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes conveying a universe of gratitude. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You're safe now." She allowed Officer Davis to lead her to a quiet corner, where she was wrapped in a thick wool blanket and given a bottle of water. The rescue was complete. The adrenaline that had been singing through Styx's veins for the last 10 minutes began to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and an even more profound sense of relief. He had seen the smoke, and he had put out the fire. The lead officer, Sergeant Miller, no relation, approached Styx after taking statements from the manager and a few other shoppers. He had an iPad in his hand. "David Miller?" he asked. Styx nodded. "Says here you're retired. 25 years with the city fire department, station 12-inch." "That's right," Styx said, surprised. The sergeant swiped a finger across the screen. A mugshot of Richard Gale appeared. "We just got the confirmation. This guy is wanted in connection with an abduction in the next state over. Same M.O. grabs a kid from a public place, buys them new clothes, and tries to blend in for a day or two before moving on. You did good, David. Real good." He clapped a hand on Styx's shoulder. "That little girl gave you the signal, but you were the one who was paying enough attention to see it. Most people would have just looked away." The validation felt good, but it wasn't the reward. The real reward arrived 20 minutes later. A frantic couple burst through the store's automatic doors, their faces etched with the worst kind of fear a parent can know. "Maya," the woman cried out, her eyes scanning the scene until they locked onto the small figure wrapped in a police blanket. The reunion was a tidal wave of emotion. They rushed to their daughter, and the 3 of them collapsed into a tangled embrace of tears and whispered assurances. For several minutes, the rest of the world ceased to exist for them. Styx watched from a distance, feeling like an intruder on a sacred moment. This was the part of the job he never got to see. In his old life, he saved a life, and then he was on to the next fire, the next emergency. He rarely saw the aftermath, the healing. After the initial storm of emotion passed, Maya's mother, Sarah, approached him. Her face was a wreck of smeared makeup and tears, but her eyes shone with a light of pure, unadulterated gratitude. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she just reached out and gripped his large, calloused hand with both of hers, squeezing it tightly. Maya's father, a man named Ben, followed her. He was trying to maintain some composure, but his voice was thick with emotion as he shook Styx's hand. We don't know how to thank you. You saved our daughter. You saved our whole world. Styx felt a lump form in his own throat. Don't thank me, he said, his voice softer than usual. Thank your daughter. She's the hero today. She's smarter and braver than any 10-year-old I've ever met. She saved herself. I was just the tool she used. Before they left with the police to give their official statements, Maya broke away from her parents and ran back to Styx. She threw her arms around his waist, hugging him with a surprising strength. She pressed her face into the rough leather of his vest. Thank you for looking angry, she whispered into the fabric. Anytime, kid, he whispered back, patting her awkwardly on the back. Anytime he watched them leave, a family made whole again by a child's courage and a stranger's attention. The first step to healing had begun, symbolized by the police blanket and the promise of hot chocolate from a paramedic. The weight of the day finally settled onto Styx's shoulders. He walked out of the store, the forgotten acorn nut still sitting on the counter inside. He swung his leg over his Harley, the familiar weight of it a comfort. He fired up the engine, and the roar was a welcome, cleansing sound in the sudden, overwhelming quiet of his own thoughts. 5 years passed. The girl from the hardware store was now a 15-year-old high school student. The trauma of her abduction had not broken Maya, it had forged her. She had turned her fear into a formidable strength. She was poised, articulate, and fiercely passionate about child safety. She worked with a local non-profit, giving presentations at middle schools about situational awareness and how to signal for help. She spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor and a teacher. She was even working with a college student to develop a simple app for kids, a discreet panic button that could alert trusted contacts and authorities. The man who had tried to silence her had inadvertently given her a voice that was now heard by thousands. The connection forged in that moment of crisis between Maya and Styx had not faded. It had deepened into a unique and powerful friendship. Her family had insisted on taking him to dinner the week after the incident, and it had become a monthly tradition. He was no longer a stranger, he was Uncle Styx. He attended her school plays and came to her 15th birthday party, his massive motorcycle looking hilariously out of place among the sedans and minivans in her suburban driveway. Every year, on the anniversary of that day, she would call him. They rarely spoke of the hardware store. They spoke of her grades, his latest cross-country ride, her frustrations with algebra, his club's newest charity initiative. Their bond was built not on the shared memory of a terrible event, but on the quiet, steady foundation of the life that came after. The story had, despite Styx's best efforts to avoid the spotlight, made local news. The Iron Sentinels MC, a group more accustomed to suspicious glares than public praise, was suddenly cast in a new light. Inspired by their brother's actions, the club decided to make a change. They started a new foundation, Sentinels for the Silent, dedicated to raising awareness and funds for missing and exploited children's networks. Their annual toy run at Christmas was expanded to include a massive fundraising ride every summer. They partnered with law enforcement to distribute child ID kits and sponsored self-defense classes for kids and teenagers. What Styx did that day had created a ripple effect, turning a single act of intervention into a sustainable wave of positive community action. On a warm Saturday in June, 5 years and 2 months after he had walked into a hardware store for acorn nuts, Styx sat on his bike at the edge of a park. A large crowd was gathered for the annual Sentinels for the Silent charity ride. At a podium set up near the stage, Maya was speaking. She was no longer a small, frightened child but a confident young woman, her voice clear and strong as it carried over the PA system. Bravery isn't about not being scared, she told the crowd. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It's about speaking up, even if your voice shakes. And it's about learning to see. Learning to see when someone is in trouble and having the courage not to look away. Her eyes found his in the crowd, and she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. Styx felt a quiet, profound pride swell in his chest. He hadn't been looking for a fight that day. He hadn't been trying to be a hero. He was just a man who had learned, through years of facing down flames, that the most important thing you can do is pay attention. Sometimes, the quietest scream is the one you have to listen to the hardest. And sometimes, the simple act of seeing someone who feels invisible is the greatest rescue of all.